Welcome back to our pre-debate interviews. We're having conversations with each of our debaters before tonight's confab on the global refugee crisis. It's my pleasure now to have some words with Mark Steyn. We know him as a celebrated columnist, a big media personality both here in Canada and the United States, Fox News, the Rush Limbaugh Show, you name it, Mark's on it. He's also a best-selling author and a much-followed recording artist, which is terrific. Mark, great to have you here and part of this conversation. Let's start with, or pick up my conversation with Nigel and have you reflect on what is a refugee in your view, and how does that relate to the debate that we're having tonight?
Well, I do take the view that Nigel expressed, that a refugee, as that word is understood, is someone who has genuine fear of persecution. And if you define that word down, I think there are great risks. There are great risks to genuine refugees, of whom there are many in the world. If you look at what's happened to the Christians in Iraq and the Yazidis, they have a genuine fear of persecution. Not just a genuine fear of persecution, a genuine fear of extermination. But there are also people who just want to live in the West, because there are nations that function and there are others that don't. And if you recall, there was a German village in Lower Saxony, I think it was Zumta, which had 102 people, and the German government said, well, you're going to be taking 750 refugees. They initially said 1,000 and then downgraded it to 750. Interestingly, that's kind of roughly the proportion of the developed world to the rest of the planet. There's 1 billion of us who live in the developed world, roughly, and about 6 billion who don't. And not a terribly large proportion of that has to come to the developed world, completely overwhelm it. The head honcho at Davos said a couple of weeks ago that he thought 1 billion people were ready to make the move from the rest of the world to the developed world, essentially because Angela Merkel hung a sign out saying, if you can get here, you can stay here.
How would you respond to the argument that Syria is a failed state, that there is mass death unfolding, variety of people responsible for that, from Assad to these various splinter groups, jihadist groups, and that arguably we, the West, had no small role to play in this collapse, in this kind of chaos? So, I mean, in a sense, what do we owe the people of Syria?
Well, I think that's a good point, and I accept much of that argument, although not in the case of Syria. I think it's certainly true in Iraq and Afghanistan. If the net result of essentially an American protectorate for 15 years is that Afghans are stampeding for the exits, that's a poor reflection on Washington and the rest of the West. But Assad and Syria, I think, is a slightly different case. But again, the question is, what is the best way to deal with that? As failed states multiply across that region and beyond, do we simply import their populations and add them to ours? I don't think so. I'd much rather we win. I'm basically, you know, a 19th century imperialist 100 years past my sell-by date. And my view is that I preferred the days, I would prefer us to be in the business of exporting liberty rather than importing people. The best thing we can do for Syrians is enable Syrians to live in Syria, and Libyans to live in Libya, and Afghans to live in Afghanistan. And the scale of these great migrations is potentially unlike anything the world has ever known.
Now, you know, as a much followed American conservative, you're someone who believes fundamentally in the values of individual liberty, the freedom of the individual, the importance of open societies. Why do you think that that kind of constellation of Western oomph and thought isn't capable of successfully assimilating people who are coming from different cultures with different mores and different views?
Well, I think it can certainly assimilate them to a degree. I said I was an imperialist, and the British successfully exported those ideas around the world, which is why people would rather live in Barbados than Haiti, and they'd rather live in Malaysia than Indonesia. And we can go all around the map and make those same comparisons. However, I do think when you are attempting to do it essentially in a bicultural way, the bicultural societies are almost always fundamentally unstable, because one population is on its way down and one is on its way up. Madame Arbor knows a lot about that from her work in both Yugoslavia and Rwanda. That's essentially what you have in continental Europe. You have countries that were hitherto ethnically homogeneous nation states that have now imported another population from the other side of the planet. If you just think of where the participants in tonight's debate come from, you've got 2 from the UK, 2 from Canada. In the scheme of things, there's absolutely minimal difference between Quebec Francophones, where Madame Arbor was born, and Ontario Anglophones, where I was born. The differences are insignificant. Yet a majority of Madame Arbor's fellow Quebec Francophones voted in 1995. They didn't want to be part of the same country as you. In the UK, the differences between Ulster Catholics and Ulster Protestants are, in the scheme of things, absolutely minimal. Yet thousands of people died in Simon Schama and Nigel Farage's country because one of those groups did not want to be in the same country as the other group. Angela Merkel understands this. When we had the financial crisis a few years ago in Europe, she understood that the real problem with Greece is not the Greek economy, but Greece's culture, that Greek people are not like German people when it comes to their working habits. And she understood at a certain level that you could not transform Greeks into Germans. Yet she seems to think now that the magic soil of Germany is so powerful that once you plant Syrian and Afghan and Yemeni and Iraqi and Somali feet on German soil, you can turn Iraqis and Afghans and Syrians and Somalis into Germans, when she knows you can't turn Greeks into Germans. That's a mad vanity.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk and maybe conclude on this, on the great melting pot. You live in the United States. It's one of the most successful countries in the world in terms of integrating people into a pan-American culture. Yet, I think to date, 1,200 Syrian refugees have been officially settled in the United States. Do you think that number is too low? Do you think it's appropriate? Do you think America, on a population base of 300 million, should be considering larger scale settlement?
Well, I will say this. I think there's a difference, and Madame Arbor was talking about this a few moments ago, that the settler, what I would call the settler nations of the West, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, are genuinely multicultural. They're different from Sweden and Finland and Germany in that respect. But the Americans are looking at this in a security context. And I take what I enjoyed listening to Madame Arbor, as I always do. And I was mildly amused by her implication, that Nigel and me are the problem, rather than Ahmed and Mohammed, which was the implication of what she was saying. But that's how the Americans look at it. There's something slightly surreal in holding this debate the week after what happened in Brussels. Because for people like Madame Arbor, they're two separate issues. Whereas for me, they're not. In a way, they testify to the limits of the assimilationist impulse. By the way, the Ellis Island model, and you're quoting Emma Lazarus's poem in the Resolution, came at a time when America like Canada and Britain and Australia, were much more confident about who they were and were willing to impose assimilation. In the absence of that, what you get is Molenbeek in Brussels, which is effectively seceded. It's an Islamic emirate within the Kingdom of Belgium. And certain numbers, not all of them by any means, but certain numbers are not yearning to breathe free. They're yearning to impose an entirely different kind of society. And that's why they blow up the airport, and that's why they blow up the railway station. And the argument you see in the New York Times is, well, these aren't refugees who are doing this. These are Belgians, and these are Frenchmen who are attacking Paris and Brussels. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that assimilation is such a failure in those areas that even second and third generation immigrants who nominally hold the passports of Western nations are so unassimilated that they want to blow themselves up at the airport in Brussels. And for me, that should occasion some modesty, that perhaps there are limits to what we can do. And it's easy to be sentimental about this. Madame Arbour talked about Catholics, and it's certainly true that in this very town, the Orange Order, not so very long ago, well within living memory, had a generally negative and condescending and patronizing view of Catholics as primitives. But we were not living, even in the worst of the Fenian raids, we were not living in a situation of cross-community sexual assault, of complete contempt for opposing cultures. History does not always repeat itself. And the fact that you can assimilate Eastern European Jews and Irish Catholics does not mean that taking a Pushtun goat herd and dropping him on a nude beach in Scandinavia is going to work out as well as previous models.
Mark, you're always fabulous to listen to. You also have a very lively online presence, so please tell our viewers where they can catch you online. Your website is terrific.
Well, that's steynonline.com, and that's Steyn with a Y, S-T-E-Y, as in, why do I have to listen to this guy coming to Roy Thompson Hall and talking all this right-wing lunatic stuff at me?
Mark, fabulous. Really enjoyed our conversation. I know you're going to be terrific on the stage tonight, and we look forward to more of it.
I'm looking forward to it too. Thanks, Roger.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Viewers, we're going to be back with our final debater tonight, Simon Schama, in a matter of moments. Stay tuned for that interview. Thanks.